Let me begin by reading a familiar passage from Scripture. 1 Samuel 17, verses 1 through 11. The Philistines now mustered their army for battle and camped between Socoh in Judah and Azekah at Ephes Damim. Saul countered by gathering his Israelite troops near the valley of Elah. So the Philistines and the Israelites faced each other on opposite hills with a valley between them. Then Goliath, a Philistine champion from Gath, came out of the Philistine ranks to face the forces of Israel. He was over 9 feet tall. He wore a bronze helmet, and his bronze coat of mail weighed 125 pounds. He also wore bronze leg armor, and he carried a bronze javelin on his shoulder. The shaft of his spear was as heavy and thick as a weaver's beam, tipped with an iron spearhead that weighed 15 pounds. His armor-bearer walked ahead of him, carrying a shield. Goliath stood and shouted a taunt across to the Israelites. "Why are you all coming out to fight?" he called. "I am the Philistine champion, but you are only servants of Saul. Choose one man to come down here and fight me. If he kills me, then we will be your slaves. But if I kill him, you will be our slaves. I defy the armies of Israel today. Send me a man who will fight me." When Saul and the Israelites heard this, they were terrified and deeply shaken. When Saul and the Israelites heard this, they were terrified and deeply shaken. Another translation uses the word dismayed, which means anxious, apprehensive, frightened, nervous, or scared, shocked, suspicious, timid. None of these are descriptions that you want your army to have, or your king. Quick quiz. In the last week, have you been anxious or had any moments of anxiety? Have you experienced any uncertainty? Have you felt insecure or lacked confidence in something? Have you been afraid or maybe dismayed or felt any moments of fear? If you haven't, it must be nice. Seriously, have you ever been afraid or terrified or anxious? Of course you have. I have too. Have you ever had to give a speech? In 1991, I had to give a speech to over 200 people. I was running for class treasurer in university. We were all first-year students, all new to campus, trying to impress each other and establish new friends. I was anxious and afraid. What if they didn't laugh? What if they didn't like what I said? What if they didn't like me? Or what if they didn't vote for me? A few years later, when I had graduated, I had to give a speech to over 2,000 people. I still felt anxiety and fear. Have you ever moved to a new area? In 1998, I moved to Chicago. I didn't know anyone. I was alone. My family and friends were hours away. I was anxious and afraid. In 2011, I moved to the UK, across the pond, this time with Christy and our 3 small kids. I still felt anxiety and fear. Have you ever started a new job? I've had many of those, and I won't bore you with that list. We experience anxiety and fear. Will I succeed? Will my coworkers like me? Will I enjoy my work? Are you living today? We live in a world that is uncertain, full of fear and anxiety. Fear would have been a normal emotion going into battle. But why were Saul and the Israelites terrified, afraid, anxious to the point that paralyzed them, causing them to run away in fright? Just because a tall, experienced fighter trash-talked them every morning? Or is there something else going on? Something systemic in Israel, something affecting the entirety of a nation. This is not a story about how God helps us face our giants with courage, or helps us live without ever having the emotion of fear. Fear is a normal emotion. However, how do we live in a world full of fear without being paralyzed by that fear? Mark Sayers, in his book, A Non-Anxious Presence, shares this quote: "When ordinary people do not know who they are, they get anxious. In 1 Samuel 17, we have the famous story of David and Goliath. We're going to find out our way in the story that is familiar. But with fresh eyes, we want to see what God has to say to us today. Saul, the king of Israel in this story, is introduced in 1 Samuel 9. He's described as the most handsome man in Israel, head and shoulders taller than anyone else in the land. In the preceding chapters, the tribes of Israel challenged Samuel and demanded a king. They literally said they wanted to be like the nations around them. They wanted a king to judge them and lead them into battle. To set the scene a bit deeper, one historical commentator described the theological and political situation in Israel at the time as a total disaster. It seems it was an uncertain and anxious time in the history of Israel. But why? Samuel was a good judge, and God was a good king. But the people of Israel continued to rebel and disobey God and the covenant they had made with him. Had they forgotten who they were? God's covenant people? Living under a covenant with God and having God as your king should have brought them peace and confident living. This relational covenant with God as their king should have absorbed the anxiety and fear that they felt in the world. But they broke the covenant, and God as their king lost legitimacy in the eyes of the Israelites. And Israel asked for a proper king, assuming this new king would bring peace and confidence, a new identity. So God said to Samuel, give them a king. And what does a king look like? Tall and attractive, because leadership is determined by one's outward appearance and physique. And what does a king do? He goes out and he fights to defend and protect them from their enemies. Well, at least this was the implication. Extreme size would make him competent to be a king. So, if the average height of a man in that day was around 5 foot to 5'6", or 152 to 167 centimeters, then Saul, a head taller, would have been 6 foot to 6'6", or 182 to 198 centimeters. The text clearly states this, and it emphasizes his height. But notice the contrast with how David, the protagonist, is introduced in 1 Samuel 16. First, Samuel is introduced to Eliab, David's older brother. Samuel was impressed, but then God tells him, don't judge by his appearance or height. Sound familiar? God continues, the Lord doesn't see the things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. In chapter 16, verse 11 to 12, David is initially described as the youngest, out in the fields, watching the sheep and goats. He is also described as dark and handsome, with beautiful eyes. Notice the text does not say that he was tall. So, good news for short people. We see through the narrative of 1 Samuel that the main unifying feature is a continuous contrast between Saul and David. Commentator J. Daniel Hayes says, David is introduced as one who conscientiously cares for his father's sheep. And this aspect of David's character is stressed throughout 1 Samuel 16 and 17. Saul, on the other hand, is introduced in a less flattering manner, as one who is looking out for his father's lost donkeys. Chapter 17 begins in the valley of Elah, just southwest of Jerusalem, where the contrast between these two men reaches its focus climax. Saul and the Israelites are on the opposite hill from the Philistines, ready for battle. Then Goliath is introduced. He's a Philistine champion. My Bible says over 9 feet tall, or 297 centimeters. However, it's likely he was only around 6'9", or around 205 centimeters. Archaeologists and scholars of the Bible have made some recent discoveries that indicate that we've had the height of Goliath all wrong. 6'9", 205 centimeters is still massive compared to the average height of a man in that day, which was 5 to 5'6", or 152 to 167 centimeters. Goliath also wore bronze armor and carried bronze weapons. This emphasized the weight and the strength that he possessed. And he trash-talked Israel. They were afraid and deeply shaken, it says. Why were they afraid? Why was their fear paralyzing them and causing them to run away? He was a big dude. He was vocally intimidating. He had weapons and armor. He was a trained warrior. He had experience. But why were they afraid? Why the paralyzing fear or the fleeing fear? This is a moment that Israel wanted a king. They were looking to Saul. This is Saul's for such a time as this moment. How will Saul respond? His answer had significant implications. I think we already know Saul's response based on how his men were responding to the challenge. But let's continue. This is not primarily a story about David and Goliath. It is really a story about it's not really a story about two armies or even the Israelites. It's a contrast between two leaders, David, who will be the future king, and Saul, who is the king, and how they respond to the challenge from Goliath. Their response says much about who they were and how that impacted the army of Israel. Simply put, a leader's identity sets the culture. Let's go back to the text. In verse 16, it says, "For 40 days, every morning and evening, the Philistine champion strutted in the front of Israelites' army." Numbers in the Bible often serve as symbols. We see 40 mentioned in the Bible often. Noah, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. Ezekiel laid on his side for 40 days and 40 nights. Jonah, in 40 days, God is going to destroy you. 40 symbolizes a period of testing, trial, or probation. Saul and the Israelite army were being tested. God allows us to go through challenges in order to grow spiritually. Challenge develops character and solidifies our identity. Ultimately, how we respond determines what we do. In verse 8, Goliath asks an ironic question. "Why are you coming out to fight? I am the Philistine champion, but you are only servants of Saul." Was he saying, "Where is Saul, your so-called champion?" And later he says, "Choose one man, send me a man." The Israelites had requested a king precisely for this kind of challenge, to be the one to go out and fight their battles. There was one person among the Israelites who could stand up to Goliath. Literally, Saul was a head taller, only a few inches or centimeters shorter than Goliath. Saul also had bronze armor to match Goliath, likely the only other person in Israel who had bronze armor. Saul was the logical choice. As mentioned earlier, this was Saul's for such a time as this moment. Instead, he cowers to the challenge. He offers tax relief and his daughter in marriage to anyone who would take his place. I believe this is why his men were terrified and deeply shaken. Their king, the one they were following, the one they had put their hope, was not being who he was supposed to be, and therefore not doing what he was supposed to do. The story continues in chapter 17, in verses 32 to 51. David comes to Saul and says, "Don't worry, I'll go and fight him." Where did David get his confidence to take such courageous action? In 16, verse 18, we are given the CV of David when one of Saul's servants was presenting David to Saul as a potential musician to help Saul with his tormenting spirit that was troubling him. We learn that David had a reputation as a brave warrior, a man of war, and someone with good judgment. This wasn't his first rodeo. David was not a novice to this situation. In fact, in chapter 16, verse 21, we learn that David had also been serving as Saul's armor bearer. Saul's response to David's confidence? Don't be ridiculous. Verse 33, Saul adds new info why Goliath is dangerous. He is well trained. Perhaps the one area that Saul does not match up with Goliath. Notice, though, he did not mention his height. Ironically, being well trained, this is one area that David had experience with this type of challenge. David persisted. A lion or a bear came to steal. I go after them and kill them. I will do this to Goliath because he has defied the armies of the living God. God will rescue me. I imagine David saying, I have nothing to fear. I know who I am and whose I am. Where did David get his confidence? Again, look back at chapter 16, verse 18. It was also said of David, the Lord is with him. David was confident because God was with him. He was God's anointed one. Therefore, David says, I know what I need to do. The irony here in chapter 10, verse 7 earlier, Samuel said to Saul, do what must be done, for God is with you. Well, a few chapters later, Saul finally consented. What was he thinking? What caused him to do this? Maybe he saw David's zeal for and confidence in God, something he used to identify with. Maybe he was paralyzed by fear and had no other options. Either way, you know the rest of the story. David goes, armed with only a sling and some stones, and in the name of the Lord his God, he kills Goliath. It says David ran quickly out to meet him, confident, zealous, passionate, devoted, fervent. Then it says the men of Israel gave a great shout of triumph and rushed after the Philistines. Men no longer fearful and now acting with confidence, like David, like God. A new era in Israel's history has begun. We live in what Mark Sayers calls a gray zone, an in-between time that is full of uncertainty and fear and anxiety. And it can have a paralyzing effect. How do we have a non-anxious presence and live true to our identity as God's people? How do we live in a world full of fear without being paralyzed by that fear? We can learn from the contrast between David and Saul. Where did David get his confidence? In the midst of a fearful situation, to act with courage rather than running away like Saul. Don't forget, Saul and David had some key things in common. They both had God's heart. In chapter 10, verse 9, it says God gave Saul a new heart. In chapter 13, it says the Lord has sought out a man, David, after his own heart. They also both had God's presence. In chapter 10 and chapter 11, it said that God's presence was with Saul. And in chapter 16, it says that God's presence was with David. They also experienced God's victory. In chapter 14, it says wherever Saul turned, he was victorious. Chapter 17, we see both that Goliath, by God's power, was victorious over the lion and the bear and over Goliath. However, David zealously pursued the honor of the Lord his God, while Saul sought to honor himself. We see this in chapter 15, verse 12, that Saul went up to set up a monument to himself after defeating the Amalekites. And later, he begged Samuel to come with him to honor me before the elders, while David acknowledged God in all of his battles. We also see three practices in David's life that formed him as God's son and Israel's king, and prepared him to do what he needed to do. David was first obedient in the small things. He watched the sheep. He obeyed his father. He served Saul. Number 2, David had courage in the hard things. The Lord who rescues me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from this Philistine. And number 3, David walked in God's authority in all things. It says, I come to you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. David was obedient in the small things, he had courage in the hard things, and he walked in God's authority in all things. Who are you? Whose likeness are you being formed into? How will you live in a world full of fear without being paralyzed by that fear? The answer is quite simple. Will you follow the example of Saul or of David? Will you seek to honor God or yourself? Will you live in your identity as God's son or daughter, or will you reject God's invitation? If David, how do we mature as God's son or daughter? What do you need to do? I think we can learn from the 3 things mentioned just a second ago. First, be obedient in the small things. What does ordinary faithfulness look like in your life? Are you being obedient in the small things that God asks of you? Do you give God the first fruits of your time, money, and talents? Do you prioritize time with your church community? Are you ready to answer that friend when they ask you why you're so hopeful and full of peace? It says in Luke 16, verse 10, it says, if you are faithful in the little things, you will be faithful in the large ones. Be obedient in the small things. Secondly, have courage in the hard things. What challenges do you need to face with courage? Are you doing hard things that develop your character? Are you trusting in God with your health problems, that He will bring good from it? Is there a difficult colleague or an injustice at work that you need to face with grace and with mercy? Have you been asked by a friend to help with a financial need, but you have just incurred a big, unexpected car repair that tempts you to live with a scarcity mindset? Mark Sayers says, pain and suffering lead people into greater spiritual authority. Have courage in the hard things. And number 3, walk in God's authority in all things. What is Jesus inviting you into? Are you walking in the authority you've been given by God? You are called to be a husband or a parent. Are you loving and serving the best interests of your family? You are called to work at a specific company. Are you leading like Jesus in and around the other employees? You are called to be a missionary. Are you willing to move to the house or the town where God has asked? In Isaiah 30, verse 21, it says, your own ears will hear him. Right behind you, a voice will say, this is the way you should go, whether to the right or to the left. James Hudson Taylor said, many Christians estimate difficulty in the light of their own resources, and thus they attempt very little, and they always fail. All giants have been weak men who did great things for God because they reckoned on His power and presence to be with them. Our world needs people who have a non-anxious presence and who know God as their Father and thus know what they need to do. People covenanted with God and bringing the kingdom into everyday spaces of our world. This is you and I's for such a time as this moment. How will we respond? Like Saul? Or like David? How will you live in a world full of fear without being paralyzed by that fear? I hope we will honor God, be obedient in the small things, have courage in the hard things, and walk in God's authority in all things.